When Josef Fritzl applied for a permit to expand his basement in 1978, no one thought anything of it. Josef, a successful electrical engineer and father of 7, was well known in his small Austrian village where he was born and raised. No one could have imagined the horrors Josef had planned for that bunker, and it would take more than 2 decades before Josef's dirty little secret would be exposed to the shock and horror of the entire world. Let's get into it. Hi folks, and welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for spending time with me. If you're new here, my name is Delaney and I'm a true crime writer and big time murder nerd. On this channel, I like to dive into some of the worst cases, and I tend to cuss a lot. So if that sounds like your idea of a good time, go ahead and subscribe. If not, that's cool. You do you. I also just want to let everyone know that I just had a guest appearance on Ye Olde Crime podcast. I was talking with Maddie and Lindsay about the mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe. I'll put a link in the description, so go check it out. Today, I want to talk about the case of Josef Fritzl, also known as the Monster of Amstetten. Recently, there's been a rash of cases of people being kidnapped and kept locked in confinement. Obviously, the Ruby Frankie case. My last video goes into that one. But also Nagasi Zuberi, which I'll put a link up here somewhere. But none of these hold a candle to the case of Josef Fritzl, just in terms of cruelty and the sheer horror of what he did to his victim, his own daughter, Elizabeth. So I mentioned in the intro that building an underground bunker in 1978 wasn't really seen as anything out of the ordinary. World War II and the bombings that had happened were still fresh in people's memories. And in fact, Josef himself remembered his hometown of Amstetten being bombed. He was only 3 years old when Hitler marched on Austria, and he remembered his father putting him up on his shoulder so he could get a good look at him. From then on, little Josef absolutely adored Hitler. Big surprise. But that was one of the few memories he had of his father. He was an alcoholic and abandoned the family not long after that. At one point during the occupation, his mother was arrested by the Gestapo and sent to a concentration camp for 3 years. Once she got out, she was a single mother, and she seemed like she resented the burden of raising Josef. She was very cold towards him and showed him no affection and would leave him alone for days and even weeks at a time. When she was home, she would beat him for any reason. When the Allies bombed Amstetten, she went to the air raid shelters alone, leaving Josef behind. Anyway, in 1956, when he was 21, he married 17-year-old Rosemarie, and they would go on to have 3 sons and 4 daughters. When he and Rosemarie were first married, he would stay out late at night, riding his bicycle around and peeping at couples who were making out or having sex. He would expose himself to women on the street and sometimes masturbate in front of them. In 1959, Josef's mother, the woman he had so hated and feared, moved in with them. Soon their roles were reversed, and his mother came to fear him. After a year or 2, he bricked up the window to her attic apartment and told the neighbors that she had died. It would eventually come out that he had actually locked her in the attic and bricked up her window and kept her there until her actual death almost 20 years later. That's what you call foreshadowing. Somehow during that time he was able to finish his education and got his qualification in electrical engineering. And of course his criminal sexual behavior continued to escalate. At one point he attacked a woman and attempted to rape her, but she was able to fight him off. Then he followed another woman home from work. Later that night, when she was asleep and her husband was away, he broke into her house and raped her at knife point, with her infant son sleeping in the cot beside the bed. For that crime, he'd been sentenced to 18 months, but he only served about 12. But no one at home knew about any of this. At the time, Rosemarie had told friends and family that he had gone away to work on a project. While he was in prison, he said that he had planned to lock his daughter up so that he could contain and express his, quote, evil side. He even said, "I was born to rape." That's what you call Foreshadowing. 15 years after that conviction, according to Austrian law, it was taken off his police record. Anyway, while his neighbors had noticed how strict he was with his wife and kids, they just thought, if it's not your business, stay out of it. Only the people closest to the Fritzls knew what an absolute control freak he truly was. He ruled his household with an iron fist, yelling and beating at his kids for the slightest little thing. And Rosemarie was treated like just another one of Joseph's subjects. She was never allowed to have a say in anything and never given any money. If she didn't obey his every command, he would beat her. Joseph often threatened to lock her in the house if she wasn't obedient enough.
That's what you call foreshadowing.
But it was his fourth child, Elizabeth, who seemed to get the worst of Joseph's abuse. He was extremely controlling of her to the point of obsession. She was never allowed to have friends over or do anything unless he could keep an eye on her. He even took her with him everywhere he went. He would go through her things and read her diary, and he would beat her for any reason, or sometimes no reason at all. Beginning when she was about 11, Joseph began exposing himself to her and leaving adult magazines under her pillow. By the time she was 12, he began essaying her. With no friends outside of school, Elizabeth didn't really have anyone she could confide in, but her school friends all say they knew the Fritzl home was not a good place to be and that Elizabeth was deeply unhappy. Meanwhile, Joseph had been working on his underground bomb shelter. Like I said, for someone to build a bomb shelter in the 70s didn't raise any eyebrows. And Joseph building a bomb shelter under his house was even more understandable. Concrete construction was his specialty, and of course he knew how to safely install electrical systems. He hired a relative to help him with the construction tasks that, as a now middle-aged man, he couldn't handle himself. So other than himself and the relative who helped him, no one was allowed in the basement, which he called his kingdom.
That's what you call foreshadowing.
But there were certain details that didn't make sense in a bomb shelter, like the fact that the door to the shelter, reinforced with concrete, was hidden behind some rotating shelves straight out of a mystery movie. That door opened into essentially an airlock leading to yet another concrete reinforced door that could only be opened with an electronic code, which only he knew, and that could only be locked or unlocked from the outside. In early 1983, Joseph was still working on his little project, and Elizabeth was 16, almost 17. That year, she managed to escape her father's abuse by running away with a friend to Vienna. However, since she was still a minor, police were able to take her into custody and return her to her parents. In the car ride on the way back home, Joseph told Elizabeth that he would never let her run away again.
Foreshadowing.
The following year, after Elizabeth turned 18, she told her father that she'd found a job and was going to move in with her older sister in a nearby town. But Joseph was not about to allow her to escape from his control. On August 28, 1984, Joseph lured her into his workshop to help him hang a door. When Elizabeth entered the room, he came up behind her and chloroformed her. Once she was passed out, he handcuffed her and carried her down to his meticulously constructed basement. He chained her to a wall and then left, locking her inside. He then went to the police and played the distraught father to report her missing. Since Elizabeth had run away just the year before, most people assumed that she'd just done that again, but police still investigated her disappearance. Joseph knew that the police were starting to dig around and might turn up things best left secret. So after about a month, he went down to the basement and forced Elizabeth to write a letter. In it, she stated that she was alive and well and had joined a cult, and instructed them not to look for her. He drove 100 miles away to mail the letter, beginning what would become his double life. Now, with the letter from Elizabeth, and with no other evidence to go on, her missing persons case was closed, and Joseph was now free to carry out his demented fantasies. For 6 years, Elizabeth was chained to a wall in the dark, damp basement. Rats and insects infested her cave-like prison. Every couple of days, her father would come down and unchain her so he could rape and torture her. He would leave a little bit of food, just enough to last until the next time he came down there. And if Elizabeth didn't do exactly as he told her, Josef warned her that he would just leave her down there and let her starve to death. By 1988, Elizabeth had become pregnant with her father's child. So Josef gave her a medical book on childbirth, a towel, and some scissors, forcing her to give birth alone in the basement. Elizabeth named her baby Kirsten. In 1990, she gave birth again, this time to a boy she named Stefan. In 1992, she had another little girl, this one named Lisa. But Lisa's birth was different. She was born with a heart defect. Her constant crying, along with Elizabeth's pleading for him to take her to see a doctor, convinced Josef to find a way to get the baby out of the basement without raising suspicion. So he had Elizabeth write a letter stating that she couldn't look after the baby. He then put 9-month-old Lisa into a cardboard box and left her on the doorstep for Rosemarie to find. They then took baby Lisa to the hospital where she underwent emergency surgery for her heart condition. Later, Josef and Rosemarie would legally adopt Lisa. That seemed to mark a turning point in the Fritzl home. While Josef had been living kind of a double life, going downstairs every couple days, sneaking food to his growing downstairs family, now the double life was really taking off. He quit his job and went into business for himself so his whereabouts wouldn't be questioned by anyone. He would drive to towns miles away to drop off their trash and shop for diapers, food, and other kinds of things that his neighbors in Amstetten would probably question. He also brought them a TV, toys, radio, and other things to make the smelly, damp basement seem almost like a home. Elizabeth, too, tried to make the children's lives as normal as possible. She tried keeping them on a schedule and teaching them how to read and write, but it wasn't normal. Josef would essay Elizabeth right in front of the kids, specifically to humiliate her. He would threaten them that if they tried to escape, he would gas them, or just leave them down there to starve. He also told them that the door was wired so that if they tried to touch it, they would be electrocuted. And if one of them made him angry for any reason, he would turn off the electricity, leaving them in the dark with no food or water for days. 2 years after Lisa's birth, Elizabeth gave birth to another girl, Monica. This time, Josef made Elizabeth record a short message giving the baby up, then went to a payphone, called his home, and played the recording when Rosemarie answered the phone. Then he left Monica on the doorstep and adopted her too. Realizing that they needed more room, Josef put Elizabeth and the older children to work digging out the soil with their bare hands. Eventually, more rooms were created, expanding the basement to about 590 square feet. But then, in 1996, Elizabeth gave birth to twins, Alexander and Michael. Michael was having problems breathing right from the start. Ignoring Elizabeth's pleas to take the baby to a hospital, Josef instead allowed Michael to die. He then burned the tiny body in the furnace and scattered the ashes in his yard. As for Alexander, Josef again forced Elizabeth to write a letter abandoning the baby, and again Josef and Rosemarie adopted this latest foundling. In 2002, she gave birth to the 7th of her children, Felix. And he would later actually admit that he had purposefully not used birth control because he knew that the more children Elizabeth had, the more tied down she would be and less likely to even try to escape. Josef continued assaulting Elizabeth in front of the children, but now he was torturing his downstairs family in a whole new way. Besides his constant threats of gassing them or abandoning them to starve, he would bring them pictures of the 3 upstairs children, and he would show them, these children who had lived their entire lives in a windowless basement, pictures of their siblings playing outdoors, opening Christmas gifts, and taking gymnastics and music lessons. Meanwhile, above ground, over 100 different lodgers came and went from the Fritzl house. All of them were forbidden from going into the yard above the basement, and especially forbidden from going into the basement at all. While some tenants reported hearing strange sounds, Josef was always able to explain them away. In addition, social service caseworkers visited the Fritzl house 21 times to check on the well-being of the adopted foundlings. None of them found anything suspicious either. But this couldn't continue forever. In April of 2008, Kirsten, who was now 19 and had never seen sunlight in her entire life, began having seizures and losing consciousness. Elizabeth begged her father to get her help, and eventually Josef agreed to take her to a hospital. On April 18th, Elizabeth helped Josef carry Kirsten out of the basement, then turned around and went back downstairs to her other two children. When Josef brought his granddaughter to the nearby hospital, she was in grave condition. Her skin was so pale it was translucent, and her teeth were all rotten. She was suffering from seizures, going in and out of consciousness, and her kidneys and liver were shutting down. The doctors couldn't tell what was causing all these symptoms, but all of the symptoms pointed to severe neglect. But when he was questioned about what had happened, Josef acted belligerent and angry and refused to answer. He just wanted the doctors to patch Kirsten up and send her back home as quickly as possible. Then the hospital staff discovered something else that rang alarm bells. Josef Fritzl did not appear to exist. There was no record of her birth, no school records, no medical records, nothing. As Kirsten slipped into a coma, doctors knew they had to find her mother so that she could maybe shed some light on what was happening. Josef claimed he had no idea where Elizabeth was. He said he found Kirsten dumped on his doorstep with a note like the others. So doctors and police went to the media, begging Elizabeth to come to the hospital and help them save her daughter. Down in the basement, Elizabeth saw the news reports that everyone was looking for her. Somehow, she managed to convince her father to let her go to the hospital, promising she wouldn't tell anyone where she'd really been for the last 24 years. So on April 26, 2008, Josef allowed Elizabeth to take Stefan and Felix out of the basement for the first time in their lives. When Elizabeth arrived at the hospital, she looked decades older than her 42 years. She was gaunt, pale, and her hair had gone completely white. The children were equally skinny and pale. So police took Elizabeth in for questioning. At first, she kept her promise to her father and said nothing about what had happened. But once she was told that she could be charged with being an accessory to a crime, and she was promised that she would never have to see her father again, she gave up. Over the course of 2 hours, she told police about the living hell she had endured in that basement for the last 8,516 days. Josef Fritzl was arrested that day. He would be charged with multiple serious crimes, including rape, incest, slavery, kidnapping, and the murder of baby Michael. Word of the incredible story got out quickly, and news media from all over the world descended on the small town of Amstetten. Only 2 years after the notorious case of Natasha Kampusch, such a similar and unspeakable crime in a relatively small country like Austria was big news. After Kirsten's recovery, Elizabeth and all her children, confirmed by DNA test to be fathered by Josef, were taken to a psychiatric clinic in Amstetten. The officer who drove the boys there described how Felix didn't talk. He just kept his nose pressed against the window, fascinated by the outside world. They would remain in the clinic for a year, receiving medical and psychiatric treatment and learning how to adjust to life outside. Josef's trial, which began March 16, 2009, was a sensation. Only 100 hand-picked journalists were allowed to attend. At first, Josef pled not guilty. His defense was that Elizabeth had been a wild, out-of-control teen, addicted to drugs and engaging in sex work. He only locked her up, he said, to save her from such a destructive lifestyle. He told the court he wasn't a monster because he had provided his downstairs family with a TV, radio, toys, and even a Christmas tree. He even tried to say that what he had done to Elizabeth had been consensual.
Sure, Jan.
But his court-ordered psychiatric evaluations disputed this. He told his therapist, like I said, that he was born to rape and that he had locked his daughter up so that he didn't go on to rape other women. He was diagnosed with severe combined personality disorder, including borderline, schizotypal, and schizoid personalities. Before trial, Elizabeth's testimony, over 11 hours long, had been taped in order to protect her. When the tape was played, the torture she described at the hands of her father was so awful that some jurors couldn't stand to watch it for more than a couple hours at a time. Josef, who up to that point had been pretty stoic, broke down. He changed his plea to guilty, took responsibility for his crimes, and apologized to his family. He was sentenced to the maximum allowed under Austrian law, life in prison. Once he was imprisoned, he had to be placed on suicide watch, and later he had to be segregated from the general prison population because, surprise, surprise, he was intensely hated and frequently attacked. At one point, he changed his name to Josef Meyerhoff. But as disturbing as this story is, there might be even more to it. Josef Fritzl is considered to be a suspect in at least 3 unsolved murders. Police believe his earliest possible murder victim is Anna Neumeyer, who was killed with a bolt gun like the kind used to kill cattle in August of 1966. The 17-year-old had disappeared on her way to the city of Wales, about 19 miles from where he was working at the time, and her body was discovered in a field just a few miles from where he worked. Witnesses at the time described a suspect the same age and appearance as Josef Fritzl. Only a couple months later, he would be arrested for that brutal rape at knife point. He's also a potential suspect in the murder of Martina Posch, a 17-year-old who bore a stunning resemblance to his daughter. Martina was raped and strangled a short walk from the guest house Josef and Rosemarie ran in Mondsee in 1986, nearly 2 years after he'd imprisoned Elizabeth. Her body was tossed into the Mondsee Lake. A cold case team also reopened the murder file on Julia Kuer, 16, who disappeared in June 2006 in Pulkow, which is 60 miles from Amstetten. And they also looked into Gabrielle Superkova's death in 2009, making her potentially Josef's last victim. Her body was found at a lake near the Austrian-Czech border while Josef was on holiday there. Gabrielle was a sex worker, and Josef was well known to engage the services of sex workers frequently. As of the time I'm filming, he hasn't been charged with any of these murders due to the lack of evidence. But I agree with the investigators. He was a violent sexual offender, and it's just not realistic to think that he went so many years from his last known attack in the 60s to the time he was arrested in the 80s without attacking anyone other than Elizabeth. At the time I'm filming this, Josef is shockingly still alive and being held in Stein, a high-security psychiatric prison in Krems on the River Danube. He's suffering from Alzheimer's and in failing health. Recently, he co-authored a book with his lawyer called The Abysses of Joseph F., as a way, he says, to come to grips as to why he went so far astray. He also, unbelievably, believes he'll be freed one day, and he wants to try and reconcile with his family. As for Elizabeth and her children, they were given new identities and put up in a colorful house in a town known only as Village X. They wish to remain out of the spotlight, so their home is equipped with surveillance cameras warning if anyone trespasses. Their neighbors also serve as a kind of guard as well, warning off anyone who comes looking for them. Reports are that they are all doing very well and that Elizabeth has even found love and gotten married. The basement where she and her children spent so many years was for a while a kind of gruesome tourist attraction, but in 2003 it was filled with cement, forever sealing it shut. So that's all I have for this story. Thank you so much for staying with me. And if you enjoyed this kind of deep dive into terrible cases, please be sure and subscribe. And consider becoming a member or supporting me on Patreon, where not only will you get early access to videos and bonus content, but also free Murder Nerd merch. The link is below and in the description. Till next time.